In 1882, the town of Northfield, Minnesota, recorded what local newspapers called the most embarrassing criminal failure in the history of the American frontier. 8 armed men rode into town in broad daylight to rob the First National Bank. They had done it before. They were experienced. They were organized. When they rode out, 2 of them were dead, 2 more were captured within weeks, and the total amount taken from the vault was exactly $0. The bank's bookkeeper had jammed the vault lock before anyone could open it. The entire robbery lasted less than 10 minutes and accomplished nothing. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. If you are new here, this channel is where the real history of the frontier gets told without the Hollywood filter. If that is what you came for, subscribe now. There is a great deal more where this came from. Now, the bank robbery is perhaps the single most iconic crime of the Wild West. It sits at the center of the mythology the way the sheriff's duel sits at the center of the law enforcement mythology. Mention the Old West to almost anyone, and within a few seconds the image appears. Masked men on horses, a small-town bank with a single teller behind a wooden counter, a bag of cash, a fast escape down a dusty street while townspeople scatter. We have seen that scene so many times that it feels historical. It feels like something that simply happened regularly all across the frontier, as naturally as weather. Here is what the actual records show. Documented bank robberies in the American West between 1860 and 1900 number somewhere between 10 and 12 confirmed incidents, depending on which historian is counting and which events meet the threshold of a genuine bank robbery rather than a burglary or an inside job. 10 to 12 in 40 years, across a territory covering millions of square miles. That number stops most people cold. 10 to 12, not hundreds, not dozens. 10 to 12 confirmed cases in 4 decades of what we have been told was an era defined by lawless bank robbery. So if outlaws were not robbing banks, what were they actually doing? And why does the myth look the way it does? Those are the 2 questions this story is going to answer. Hold on to them, because the answers are more complicated and more interesting than you might expect. Let us start with what crime on the frontier actually looked like, not what the movies showed. What the records, the newspaper accounts, the court documents, and the sheriff's logs actually describe. The most common crime on the American frontier was theft. Simple, unglamorous theft. A horse taken from a hitching post. A saddle removed from an unattended barn. A wallet lifted in the crowd outside a saloon on a Saturday night. Tools stolen from a mine claim while the miner was working a different shaft. Supplies taken from a supply wagon during a river crossing when the driver's attention was elsewhere. Horse theft deserves a special attention because it was treated with a seriousness that surprises modern readers. In a culture where a man's horse was often the difference between survival and death, where the distances between settlements could be measured in days of riding rather than hours, stealing a man's horse was considered one of the most serious offenses possible. In some territories, it was a hanging offense by community consensus, even when no formal law existed to define the punishment. More men were killed or executed for horse theft on the frontier than for any crime we would consider equally serious today. The second most common category of serious crime was robbery on the road, not bank robbery. Road robbery. A lone traveler or a small group moving between settlements, carrying cash from a cattle sale or a mining payout, was a target that required far less organization, far less planning, and far less risk than a bank in the middle of a town full of armed men. Stagecoach robbery sits in its own category and deserves its own examination. Because this is where the myth gets interesting. Stagecoach robbery was real. It happened with genuine regularity during specific periods and in specific corridors. The Wells Fargo Company kept detailed records of attacks on its coaches, and those records show that between 1870 and 1884, there were over 240 documented stage robberies in California alone. 240 in 14 years. That averages out to more than 17 per year in a single state. So here is the paradox that the mythology smooths over without noticing. The same era that almost never saw a bank robbery saw stagecoach robberies happening on a near-weekly basis in active regions. Why? The answer is almost embarrassingly practical. A stagecoach moving through a remote stretch of road between two towns was isolated in a way that a bank in the center of a settlement was not. The stage had at most a driver and a guard. It moved on a predictable schedule along predictable routes. A man who had studied that schedule knew exactly where the coach would be at what hour of the day. A remote canyon or a wooded stretch of trail was a location where 2 or 3 men with rifles could stop a vehicle without anyone seeing them, do it, and without any population nearby to respond. A bank in a town was the opposite of all of those things. It was in the middle of a community. It was surrounded by people who were, by the standards of the era, heavily armed and not particularly reluctant to use their weapons. It had a staff who knew their town and their neighbors. And, critically, it was the institution that held the financial assets of the most economically powerful men in the community, men who had both the resources and the motivation to pursue anyone who targeted their money with the most aggressive response available. Robbing a bank in a frontier town meant robbing the town's most dangerous and most motivated enemies, simultaneously, in front of witnesses, with horses that could be identified and tracked. The men who actually robbed banks, and there were some, were not typical frontier criminals. They were something closer to military operations in their planning requirements. The James Younger Gang, the most documented of the bank robbing outfits, operated in coordinated groups of between 6 and 12 men, spent weeks or months on reconnaissance before a robbery, had established escape routes planned in advance, and relied on a network of sympathizers and safe houses that would have been more at home in a spy novel than in the dime store westerns that later told their story. And even they failed more often than they succeeded. Northfield, Minnesota was not an anomaly. It was a pattern. Let us talk about who these men actually were, because here is another place where the mythology has built something almost entirely fictional on top of a much more complicated reality. The popular image of the frontier outlaw is of a specific type, a free spirit, someone who rejected the constraints of settled society, not from desperation, but from a kind of philosophical independence, someone who lived by his own code, who was dangerous, certainly, but dangerous in a way that carried a certain romantic weight. The reality of most frontier outlaws was considerably less cinematic. Many of the men who turned to criminal activity on the frontier did so after economic failure of a more ordinary kind. Failed miners who had spent years underground for wages that left them with nothing. Former soldiers from both sides of the Civil War who came home to find their communities destroyed, and their skills, which were essentially the skills of organized violence, useless for civilian life. Men who had arrived in the West with specific economic expectations and found those expectations entirely unmet after years of honest effort. The turn toward crime was rarely a philosophical statement. It was usually a practical calculation made by men who had run out of other options and who assessed, correctly or not, that the risks of robbery were lower than the continued certainty of poverty. That assessment was often wrong. The life expectancy of an active outlaw on the frontier was not romantic. It was short and usually ended badly. Not in a dramatic final confrontation, though some did end that way. More often in an ambush, an arrest on a minor charge that led to identification, a betrayal by an associate, a mistake made during a robbery that left a man identifiable. The careers of most frontier outlaws lasted between 2 and 5 years. Some lasted less. The men who lasted longer were generally the ones smart enough to spend most of their time not committing crimes, living quietly between operations in ways that made them difficult to distinguish from ordinary settlers. Now, here is something worth pausing on, because it challenges a belief so deep most people have never examined it. We tend to assume that frontier outlaws and frontier law enforcement were clear opposites, two distinct categories of people, cleanly separated by the choices they had made and the roles they played. The outlaw on one side of the law, the lawman on the other, never overlapping. The historical record does not support this picture. Not cleanly. The line between outlaw and lawman on the frontier was permeable in ways that would be scandalous by modern standards and were, by frontier standards, largely unremarkable. Men moved between categories depending on circumstance, opportunity, and who happened to be offering employment at any given moment. A man with a reputation for violence and competence was useful to both sides of that line. A town that needed a marshal hired whoever could do the job. That person's previous activities were not always scrutinized carefully. A criminal organization that needed someone capable of planning and executing an operation looked for similar qualities. The same man, with the same skills, might serve in both capacities at different points of his life. This was not a secret or a scandal in its time. It was simply how things worked in environments where formal institutions were weak, where personal reputation and individual capability mattered more than official credentials, and where the definition of legal and illegal was itself unstable and locally variable. The celebrated lawmen of frontier history almost universally had complicated backgrounds. Not one or two of them, most of them. Men who are remembered as heroes of frontier law enforcement had, at various points, been wanted for offenses in different jurisdictions, had operated on both sides of the legal line, had used their positions for personal financial benefit, or had histories of violence that preceded their badge-wearing years by a considerable distance. This does not make them villains. It makes them human. But it does make the clean moral categories of the mythology essentially fictional. Here is something that almost no one thinks about when they picture the frontier outlaw. What did these men eat? It sounds like a trivial question. It is not. Because the logistical reality of living outside settled society on the frontier imposed constraints that the mythology ignores entirely. A man living outside the law could not simply walk into a general store and buy supplies without risk. He could not stay in a hotel under his real name in any town where he was known. He could not travel the main roads between settlements without the possibility of being recognized. He was confined, for most of his time, to the margins of the landscape, remote camps, abandoned structures, the rougher terrain that law enforcement and ordinary travelers tended to avoid. In those places, food was whatever he could carry, whatever he could hunt, and whatever local contacts might provide. Dried meat when it was available, hardtack, coffee if he had planned ahead. Game when the hunting was good and making a shot would not attract unwanted attention. Winter in those conditions, in the mountain ranges and high plains where many outlaw bands operated, was a serious physical challenge. Men who romanticize the outlaw life tend to picture the campfire under the stars. They do not picture the 3-day storm that made the fire impossible to light, the horses that needed feeding when there was nothing to feed them, the wound from a previous encounter that was not healing correctly because there was no doctor available and no way to reach one without risking arrest. The unglamorous physical reality of living outside the law was one of the main reasons outlaw careers were short. It was not sustainable, not practically. The body has limits that the mythology ignores. Let us move from the individuals to the organizations, because here is another area where the popular image creates a picture that the historical record substantially contradicts. We tend to imagine frontier criminal organizations as exactly that, organizations, with leadership structures, established territories, codes of conduct. The outlaw gang as a kind of alternative social institution, operating by its own rules, but with genuine internal coherence. Most frontier criminal groups were considerably less organized than this picture suggests. They were loose associations of men who worked together for specific operations and then separated. They had no formal leadership in most cases, though someone usually had more authority than the others by virtue of reputation, experience, or force of personality. They had no territories in any formal sense. They had no codes of conduct that were consistently enforced. They had agreements sometimes. They had histories of working together. They had, occasionally, genuine loyalty. They also had betrayal, frequently. When a group member was arrested and faced serious punishment, the calculation about whether to provide information about associates in exchange for leniency was a practical one, and many men made it in the direction of self-preservation. The archives of frontier law enforcement are full of cases where successful arrests and prosecutions resulted directly from information provided by people who had been, until recently, active members of the same group. This was not considered particularly shameful by the standards of the time. It was considered rational. Men who had entered criminal activity for practical reasons tended to make practical decisions when the risks changed. Now let us ask a question that the mythology of the frontier outlaw almost never raises. Who were the victims? Not in a moral or emotional sense, in a practical, documented sense. When frontier crimes occurred, who actually bore the consequences? The answer is almost never the wealthy, almost never the powerful, almost never the people that the romantic version of the outlaw sometimes depicts as the natural targets of men who operated outside a corrupt system. The victims of frontier theft and robbery were, overwhelmingly, people very much like the perpetrators. Working men, small merchants, miners who had saved their wages for months, travelers carrying the proceeds of a cattle sale that represented an entire season's labor, homesteaders whose horses and tools were the difference between next year's crop and starvation. The stagecoach that got robbed was not carrying the savings of mining company executives. It was carrying payroll for workers, remittances from men sending money home to families, the earnings of small businessmen doing their ordinary commerce across the distances of the frontier landscape. This fact sits awkwardly with the Robin Hood narrative that has attached itself to certain famous outlaws. The Jesse James legend, in particular, benefits from a story in which banks represent Eastern financial interests oppressing ordinary farmers and ranchers. James and his associates are cast in this version as rebels against a system that had treated the working people of Missouri unfairly in the aftermath of the Civil War. there is a grain of genuine historical context in this framing. The economic conditions of post-Civil War Missouri were genuinely hard on small farmers. The railroad and banking interests that were expanding into the region did represent a kind of financial power that many ordinary people resented. The James family had suffered real losses during the war years, but the actual victims of the James Younger gang's crimes were not those financial institutions in any significant sense. The money taken in raids on banks and trains was largely the money of ordinary depositors, ordinary passengers, ordinary payroll recipients. The gang's operations imposed their costs on the same communities the legend claims they were defending. The gap between the legend and the documented activity is not subtle. It is wide enough to constitute a different story entirely. Let us talk about trains, because train robbery is another crime that the frontier mythology has elevated to something it was not in practice. Train robbery was real. It was a genuine feature of the frontier criminal landscape from the late 1860s onward. The first documented train robbery in the American West occurred in 1870 in Nevada, when a group of men stopped a Central Pacific locomotive by placing an obstruction on the tracks and boarded the express car. The technique spread. Over the following 3 decades, train robberies occurred across the western states with enough frequency that the railroad companies developed specific responses. Express cars, the cars that carried valuables and cash, were increasingly reinforced. Armed guards were standard. The companies hired detective agencies, most famously the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, to pursue train robbers specifically. The Pinkerton Agency's role in frontier crime and law enforcement is itself a story that the mythology has almost entirely ignored, and it is worth a moment's attention. The Pinkertons were not frontier lawmen in any sense the mythology would recognize. They were a private corporation hired by the railroad and express companies to protect their assets. Their methods were whatever their clients paid for, and the law, where the law existed, permitted. Their pursuit of train robbers and bank robbery suspects was relentless, and not always scrupulous about the line between investigation and intimidation. They used informants systematically. They conducted surveillance operations that presuppose organizational resources far beyond anything available to a frontier sheriff's office. They crossed jurisdictional lines that constrained official law enforcement, and they were effective enough that the railroad companies continued to pay for their services for decades. The relationship between private corporate security and public law enforcement on the frontier was, in practice, considerably closer than the mythology acknowledges. The famous pursuits that became legends were often, in reality, corporate-funded operations using private resources that happened to conclude with public prosecutions. Here is another thing worth examining carefully: the geography of frontier crime. We tend to imagine the Wild West as a uniform landscape of lawlessness. Every town dangerous. Every road a potential site of robbery. Every night potentially the last one. The danger uniformly distributed across the entire frontier territory. The actual distribution of crime and violence was nothing like this. It was concentrated, densely concentrated in specific places and along specific routes, and largely absent from most of the frontier most of the time. The corridors that saw the most criminal activity were the ones that moved money in quantities large enough to attract attention. The routes between major mining strikes and the nearest railroad connections. The cattle drive, trails and their endpoints, particularly the Kansas cattle towns of Abilene, Dodge City, and Wichita. the stage lines carrying express shipments between population centers. A homesteader in western Kansas in 1875 might go for years without a direct encounter with any criminal activity more serious than petty theft. A teamster driving supply wagons between a mining camp and the nearest railhead was operating in a substantially more dangerous environment. The difference was not the era or the general region, it was the specific economic activity and the specific route. The cattle towns deserve particular attention because they are perhaps the most mythologized locations in all of frontier history. Dodge City. The name alone carries enough mythology to fill several films. The most dangerous town of the West, the place where violence was simply the weather, constant and inescapable. Here is what the actual records from Dodge City show. During the peak years of the cattle trade, between 1876 and 1885, the average number of homicides per year in Dodge City was approximately 1.5, 1.5 people killed per year. In a peak season, when the cattle drives arrived and the population temporarily swelled to several times its ordinary size, the numbers were higher. But averaged across the full period, 1.5 homicides annually was the actual figure. For comparison, cities like New York and New Orleans in the same period had homicide rates per capita that were higher. The most dangerous cities in late 19th century America were not on the frontier. They were on the East Coast, in the crowded industrial neighborhoods where poverty, overcrowding, and genuine social breakdown created conditions for violence that no frontier cattle town matched. This does not mean Dodge City was peaceful. It means that the specific kind of danger it represented was real but bounded. Concentrated in specific places, the saloons and gambling establishments that lined the cattle trade district at specific times, the weeks when the drives arrived, and involving a specific population, the cowboys at the end of long drives who were young, male, exhausted, and suddenly in possession of wages they had not been able to spend for months. That specific combination produced trouble, reliably. But it was not the constant ambient danger that the mythology suggests. Now here is something that should reset attention completely, because it challenges not just the Western mythology, but the entire framework through which we tend to understand frontier crime. The most economically significant crime of the frontier era was not robbery of banks, stages, trains, or travelers. It was fraud, land fraud, mining claim fraud, railroad fraud, financial manipulation by the corporations and individuals who controlled capital in the expanding West. The theft conducted through contracts, through misrepresentation, through political corruption, through the systematic manipulation of legal structures that ordinary people had no resources to challenge. The amount of money taken from ordinary settlers, miners, and investors through fraudulent schemes during the frontier period was orders of magnitude greater than the total amount ever taken in all the bank and train robberies combined. Land speculators who filed fraudulent claims under the Homestead Act and then sold the land to developers rather than farming it. Mining company promoters who raised capital from Eastern and European investors by misrepresenting the extent of deposits that were already exhausted. Railroad companies that received federal land grants of staggering size and then sold that land in ways that enriched their principals at the expense of everyone else involved in the transaction. These crimes were committed by men in offices, in suits, with lawyers and accountants, and political connections. They were crimes that the legal system was structured, in many cases, to accommodate rather than prevent. Their perpetrators were not outlaws. They were, by the formal standards of their society, pillars of it. and they were never cast as villains in the myth, not in the dime novels, not in the films, not in the cultural memory of the frontier. The man with the mask and the gun who took a few $100s from a stagecoach became a legend. The man with the prospectus and the attorney who took tens of thousands of dollars from investors who would never recover them became a businessman. That distinction tells us something important about which crimes a society chooses to mythologize and which it chooses to absorb quietly. Let us come back now to the question we opened with, not just about bank robbery, about the entire framework of frontier crime. If most of what we believe about outlaws and crime in the Wild West is substantially wrong, why does the myth look the way it does? Part of the answer is the dime novel. These were inexpensive, mass-produced publications that began appearing in the 1860s and reached enormous circulation by the 1870s and 80s. They were the dominant popular entertainment of their era in the way that streaming television is the dominant popular entertainment of ours. And they needed stories, constant, fresh, dramatic stories that their readers would pay for. Real frontier crime, as we have established, was mostly monotonous. Theft, petty fraud, road robbery, disputes over land and water rights. None of that was material for a story that sold. What sold was drama, confrontation, the singular dangerous man against the singular force of order, the robbery that required daring, the escape that required cunning. The dime novel writers were not historians. They were entertainers. They took real names, real places, real incidents, and they reworked them into narratives that had the shape stories were supposed to have. Beginning, middle, end, tension, climax, resolution, hero and villain in clear opposition. And because those stories were what reached the public, and because the public's understanding of the frontier was built almost entirely on what reached them rather than what they could verify, the story became the history. Gradually, over decades, until the version in the dime novel, refined and expanded by the films that followed, became what people meant when they said the Wild West. The actual bank robbers became legendary. The actual stagecoach robbers, who were far more numerous and far more representative of frontier criminal reality, were largely forgotten because their crimes were not as dramatically satisfying as a bank robbery. The actual fraud artists, who stole more money than all the outlaws combined, were absorbed into the legitimate business history of the era and remembered, if at all, as colorful entrepreneurs. This is worth thinking about, not just as a corrective to a specific myth, but as a lesson in how myths get made generally. We do not remember history as it was. We remember the version that had the best narrative shape, the version that gave us characters we could understand, conflicts we could follow, and resolutions that felt satisfying. The messy, mundane, complicated reality gets edited, not dishonestly, exactly, just in the direction of the story. The frontier was full of stories that had good narrative shape. There were genuine, dramatic confrontations. There were genuine, larger-than-life individuals. There were genuine moments of courage and genuine moments of brutality that are worth remembering. But those moments existed within a vast, much less dramatic landscape of ordinary life and ordinary crime that the narrative process systematically removed because it did not serve the story being told. We are left with the legend. And the legend is not useless. It tells us what the culture that created it valued, feared, and wanted to believe about itself. It tells us what kind of freedom Americans were dreaming about in the decades after the Civil War, when the frontier was still open and the industrial age was closing in, and the idea that a man could simply ride west and start over still felt possible. That is not nothing. Myths carry real information about the people who create them. But we should be able to hold the myth and the reality at the same time, to understand what the story was built for without mistaking it for the thing itself. Here's a question for you before we finish. Now that you know what frontier crime actually looked like, which version surprises you more? The myth, for how completely it displaced reality, or the reality, for how much more complicated and human it turns out to be? Leave your answer in the comments. We read every one of them. The real outlaws of the American frontier were not romantic. They were not rebels with a code. Most of them were working men who had run out of other options, making practical decisions in difficult circumstances, and generally ending badly in ways that no film has ever found a way to make look interesting. The real crimes of the frontier were not the ones with masks and horses. They were the ones with contracts and signatures and the quiet machinery of a legal system that was still being built and was being built, in many cases, by the people who most benefited from building it a certain way. The real history is not less dramatic for being true. It is more dramatic in the way that reality is always more complex and more weighted with consequence than anything a story can fully contain. This is Mystery Wild West, and this is where we tell it as it was. Stay with us. There is more to uncover.